Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Educator Speaker Series, Arts Integration in the Elementary Classroom. Next slide, please. I'm really excited about today's topic, and I cannot wait to introduce today's speakers. My name is Laura Schilling, and I'm the Content Specialist for Teacher Programs here at LACMA. I am a white woman with curly blonde hair and bangs. I'm wearing a blue shirt today, and I'm sitting in my living room. You can kind of see the corner of a painting behind me. If you would like to access live captions today, please go ahead and click live transcript at the bottom of your screen and then show subtitle. And that way you'll be able to access the captions. My AV colleagues are also providing tech support today. So if you have any tech related questions, please feel free to send Irving Artero tech support a message. Next slide. I'd also like to share a land acknowledgement from my current residents on ancestral unceded Tongva land, part of which is now known as South Los Angeles. LACMA respectfully acknowledges that the lands on which our museum is built and the region that we serve is the ancestral and unceded territories of the Gabrielino Tongva, Gabrielino Kizh, Fernandeño Tataviam, and Ventureño Chumash peoples. Los Angeles County has been and is home to many indigenous peoples. So today's program is going to start with presentations from 4 teachers from the Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet School. And that'll be followed by some breakout rooms so you can discuss the ideas from the presentations, as well as a Q&A with the teachers before we conclude for the evening. Next slide. And I'm going to go ahead and share a link in the chat now that includes some information about upcoming events and resources. Checking this page from time to time or subscribing to our mailing list are both great ways to stay updated on LACMA's teacher programs. You can also use this link to sign up for our next Educator Speaker Series event, which is taking place in May with art teacher Sydney Snyder, who will share small steps all teachers can take to create more inclusive, accessible classroom environments. Next slide, please. We have a packed program today, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Raquela Bases is a 4th grade teacher at Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet. This is her 2nd year teaching at a visual arts magnet. She is a graduate of UCLA's teacher education program and a member of the UCLA Writing Project leadership team. Cecille Cervancia is a mother of 2, an artist, and an educator with LAUSD since 2007. She has taught elementary school as well as reading, math, and art to middle school students and is currently a 2nd grade teacher at the Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet. Olivia Martinez is a public elementary school teacher, and this is her 22nd year working for LAUSD. During this time, she has served as a classroom teacher, reading intervention teacher, and instructional coach. Olivia currently teaches 1st grade at Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet. And Catherine Tyson has over 20 years of teaching experience with LAUSD. She has centered her work with children on developing creativity. Ms. Tyson presently teaches 3rd grade at Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet, surrounded by caring, like-minded teachers and artists for whom she is grateful. I'm so grateful to have all of these amazing minds in the space with us today, and I'm going to hand it over to Cecille now, who's going to start us off. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. That was a great introduction. Thanks, Laura. I'm Cecille Cervancia. I am a light-skinned Filipina. I have purple, wavy-ish, medium-length hair. I'm wearing like a bluish gray top with there are no sleeves, and behind me is my bookshelf with plants and books. All right, so to start us off, I would like to give you all some background information about our school. Next slide, please. Next slide. Charles White Elementary School opened in 2004 in the building formerly occupied by the Otis College of Art, where Charles White was once a professor and head of the drawing department. Our campus houses a museum quality art gallery in partnership with the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Our visual arts magnet program uses art as a content area and visual art strategies for building access to content areas across the curriculum. Creating a culture of creativity is our motto. Next slide, please. Since 2007, LACMA has programmed exhibitions at the Charles White Elementary School Gallery. In the fall of 2018, LACMA began its collaboration with LAUSD for a newly formed Visual Arts Magnet Center on the school campus, serving as a center for teaching and learning about the visual arts. To date, LACMA has presented 9 exhibitions at Charles White Elementary School, with more to come. Next slide, please. And at this moment, I'd like to hand it off to Raquela.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our mission statement. At Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet, we provide a fully integrated visual art with academic curriculum, fostering creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration in our students through standards-based instruction. We are creating a culture which develops creativity in every student. Next slide, please.
Hi, I'm Catherine Tyson. I'm a white woman with a side ponytail, and I'm wearing a blue shirt and glasses. I'm in my living room in front of some curtains. Integrated learning is an intention to make connections among ideas and experiences across the curriculum and to transfer learning to new situations. The quality of learning improves because students are able to integrate information across disciplines instead of acquiring knowledge solely in isolation. There are many examples of integrated learning in education, such as project-based learning. Next slide, please. In our visual arts magnet, we're working on integrating visual arts. The visual arts grounds and centers our instructional program. We're different from a school which has a teacher that teaches the visual arts to all the students, like an art teacher. That's great to have, but that's not what we're doing. Sometimes schools or teachers use the arts as a hook or a motivation, such as students adding a picture to a piece of writing. The students get to draw, and drawing is fun, but the drawing is intended to motivate the students or to help them finish their writing, and we aren't doing that. We are developing a program where the visual arts are the approach to teaching, the way in which we teach. Teachers and students use the creative process to explore connections between an art form and another subject area to gain greater understanding in both. The experience is mutually reinforcing. We are teachers engaged in creating an instructional program which connects the visual arts to the other areas of the curriculum and the curriculum to the visual arts. Next slide, please. We are exploring integration of visual arts into as many areas of the curriculum as possible. We began with writing and social emotional learning, and then we added English language development, then social studies, science, and math. Next slide, please. We have worked as a group of teachers to build some common strategies amongst the 5 of us to use in multiple areas of the curriculum. We all use comic books, sketch notes, and art discussion strategies such as See, Wonder, Think. Our intent is for our students to become more adept at these strategies as they move through the grade levels, and we believe that these particular strategies will transfer to middle school and beyond. Next slide, please.
So as we've been, since we've started our magnet about 4 years ago, we've been really interested in how the arts integration and working with LACMA has impacted our students, our community, and our teaching team. So in terms of academic impact, we've been able to maintain high expectations for mastery and content areas while also integrating art. In fact, it feels like integrating the art has actually led to higher mastery of the standards. And this is reflected in some district assessment data that matches or exceeds sometimes school and district averages. We've also seen that arts integration has provided multiple entry points for students with varying needs. 14% of our students in the magnet receive special education services. And art has been a way for many of them to access and express themselves and demonstrate what they've learned in a way that might not have been available for them in a traditional program. Our English language learners have also greatly benefited from our magnet program. We provide a lot of opportunities for students to practice English without limiting their access to high-level academic content. Just last week, one of our newcomers' first independent sentences in English was during a discussion about Matisse. So that was very exciting for us. But we've also noticed social emotional impact as well. We've seen many of our students who struggle in content areas have more success during arts integration lessons. This success has led to higher levels of self-confidence, which often transfers over to other academic areas. By really focusing and teaching students the idea of process over perfection, they also are learning that they can get better at art and at basically anything over time with effort and practice, which is an important lesson for our students, but also for us as teachers as well. An interesting benefit of the magnet has been a very strong sense of community between the students, the families, and the teachers. Since our students follow each other in a sort of cohort from grade to grade, they've developed really deep connections with each other. We've also formed strong connections with families. So in my class right now, about half of the students I've taught their siblings or cousins before, so we know their families really, really well. This generational commitment to the arts and arts integration leads to a better understanding of our school vision and instructional philosophy. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, and I forgot to say, I am a white presenting mixed ethnicity woman. I have blondish brown hair, black t-shirt on, and dangly earrings. I'm in my living room with books and pictures and things behind me. So I am Olivia Martinez. I'm going to start us off. I teach first grade at the Visual Arts Magnet. And each of us is going to talk a little bit about a project that we have found particularly successful in our program. So I'm going to talk about a phonics flashcard unit that I developed with one of our teaching artists, Jenny Ziamek. So and I think she's here too. Hi, Jenny. Okay, so we started teaching this online last year and have continued and improved this lesson in person. And the general idea that we had when we started this lesson was, how can we create a phonics lesson that is a little bit more engaging to the students? And how can we make sure that it's connected to real reading and writing? So what I'm going to share with you is a phonics and arts standards-based lesson that helps you come up with a product that the students can use during their instructional day. So as I share and as you think about these ideas, try to think about how you could possibly use this in your own class or instructional setting. As you listen, try not to go to that place that we go to a lot as educators when you're at a PD and you're like, well, that's for first graders, I teach high school, or my students couldn't do that, or I don't even teach phonics. And instead, think about how you might use the general idea or principle of the lessons to help you engage your students more meaningfully in your instruction. Okay, next slide. So this is the general structure of the lessons. I usually start by talking about the objectives, and then I have the students say a little affirmation, and then we look at the art, and after we look at the art, we have a drawing lesson. After the drawing lesson, we do some word collecting. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are the art standards, and we start arts and ELA standards. We start each lesson with our learning objective, and these are based on Common Core state standards, and the art ones are from National Core Art Standards. So we thought that asking students to create their own flashcards would give them a little more ownership of this very isolated phonics skill. A lot of times when we teach phonics, it's in isolation, it's not connected to any real reading or writing, and we thought, how can we combine these two things? We also thought that the artwork and the discussion of it would help and provide a more engaging experience for students, and that might then cement these sounds in their head a little bit more than if we just taught them in isolation. Next slide. So I like to have my students say these affirmations before we start the lesson. And I feel that this kind of helps the students understand and internalize the objective of the lesson. The art affirmation in particular helps students mentally and emotionally prepare for a new drawing skill. I find that when they say this affirmation and when we repeat it, it helps curb their expectation of what the art might end up looking like later on. Okay, next slide. So after we do our objectives and our affirmations, we then start looking at some artwork. Next slide. So we typically look at art from LACMA's collection, and one reason is that we partner with LACMA, but the other reason is that we want students to be exposed to as much of the collection as possible at LACMA, because this is one of their many museums that they go to, but we want those visits when they go to LACMA to be more meaningful and exciting for them. We want them to go there and see the artwork and be like, oh, we talked about that, or I drew that. We had a discussion about that. We think that makes it a little more exciting for them to go. So of course, when you guys are doing this, if you do any of these ideas, you can use any artwork that meets the needs of your students or your community or your lesson objectives, or the artwork from your own local museum. So our first year when we did this online, we used visual thinking strategies to kind of guide and facilitate our general conversation around the artwork. After reviewing what the sound and consonant blends would make, we would then ask students to find something in the artwork that starts with the same sound. So for example, we'd ask them, look at the picture and tell us what you see in there that makes the brr sound. Then we'd have a normal kind of general conversation about what's going on in the picture. What do you see that makes you say that? What more can we find? However, this past year, we started reflecting a little bit more on how we can increase the rigor of the discussions. And we started looking at the art standards a little bit more closely. So we decided we can ask questions that would reflect that standard. So if you look at that second question, why do you think someone put these items here? What do you think will happen next? That kind of guides the students and talks about sequencing maybe, or inferencing, or predictions. And then the next question, if you had to eat one of these foods on the table, which one would you eat? That kind of gets the students ready for an opinion writing unit that we have that's upcoming. Next slide. So for the CR blend, we knew that this was going to be a particularly difficult object to draw. And so the questions here, we geared them towards, how would you describe it towards someone who can't see it, to kind of get the students to think about what it looks like, the parts, where they're located, and then let's trace it with our fingers. So even just kind of physically having them draw it out as a rehearsal for drawing the actual crab. Next slide. So this particular artwork that we looked at, the second question, where do grapes come from and how do they get from where they grow to us, led to a really, really rich discussion about farm workers and how we get the food that we eat every day. And then the last question, what do you notice that the artist did that you want to do when you draw your grapes? That again led the students to start rehearsing and practicing what kind of decisions they were going to make in their artwork. Okay, next slide. After we look at all the artwork, and we usually do about 2, sorry if you heard a motorcycle in my house. So we usually do about 2 cards every lesson, because that's about half an hour to 45 minutes to do all that. So after that, what we do is we have a drawing lesson. Next slide. So these are a couple examples of some of the flashcards that we've made with our students. So I'm really lucky, we're really lucky at our school that we have Miss Jenny, who's a professional illustrator, lead the drawing lessons. And I've learned a lot, and my drawing has even improved from watching Miss Jenny. But sometimes when she's not available or when I do a different lesson, I have been able to do this by myself. So don't get scared if you're not a professional either. YouTube has a lot of drawing videos, and you can practice on your own as well. So we don't usually copy the artwork itself. Most often what we do is we take one of the objects, obviously that matches the blend that we're doing, and we teach them how to draw that object in a very kid-friendly way. Now, this is a really specifically intentionally guided drawing lesson where students follow us step by step. We have this goal because as the first grade teacher, we've discussed how important it is for students to develop these drawing skills. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe this is all so that I get better as an illustrator. I'm not sure. I'll have to talk to my team later. But so we are really wanting them to practice these skills and get better as artists, as illustrators. All of the students have sketchbooks in the whole magnet, and we also encourage them to draw and practice these repeatedly during the day, during the course of the year, to get better and better and see how that practice leads to better drawings. Next slide. Here's another couple examples of our blends. Next slide. So the next part is our word collecting. Word collecting is kind of the main point of doing all of these drawings and making these flashcards. Next slide. So this can be done independent work or guided. The way that I do it is I usually start off as a whole group instructional activity. So for example, we'll add words to the cards as a class. So if we come across a blend during a read aloud or in the hallway, we'll add it to a large chart and start making this word collection. And then what they'll do is they'll start transferring those words to their own cards. Next slide. So you could see a couple examples of some of the students, some of the things that came up for them and that they put on their word card, on their flashcard. This also comes in handy during readers workshop. If you do some sort of readers workshop or reading activity, as you guys are reading and you find a word that has one of the blends or digraphs that you're working on, that you could add it to the cards. The kids get really excited kind of looking and hunting for these words as well. And then another big way that I use these is during writers workshop or any type of writing activity when they have to come up with a word that has one of those blends. And then I make it really like, oh, you guys, oh, that's the flower card. Get your cards out, everybody, put it in there. Let's check, let's all add it to there. So it really helps reinforce those sounds in both reading and in writing. Next slide. So how might you use any of these ideas in your classroom or your setting? First grade is very different from maybe some of the things that you guys are teaching, but take a second to kind of think about how you might use this idea, the structure, or even just looking at arts or illustrated flashcards, how you might use that in your own classroom or your instructional setting. And maybe think about what other types of flashcards or words your students could collect in your classroom. Maybe take a second and maybe add a couple ideas to the chat that maybe just pop into your mind. Let's see. Okay. Oh, okay. Anything in there? Science. Yeah, that's actually something I was thinking about in terms of, I was actually thinking of medical school, like how they make flashcards in med school. Let's see. Synonyms. Yeah, nice. Good. Well, we'll have more time later on to share some of these ideas, and you'll be able to kind of reflect and think about some ideas for your class later on after you hear each of the other presentations. So thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it off to Miss Cecille Cervancia, our second grade magnet teacher.
Hello again, everybody. Next slide, please. Here's Olivia's contact information in case you have any questions or want to share ideas with her. You could just go ahead and email her. All right, next slide. Okay, so before I begin, I want to acknowledge the educators and LACMA staff that provided us with the professional development to even begin talking about art in the first place. And these wonderful people are Dr. Veronica Alvarez, Erin Ranum, Laura Schilling, Holly Gillette, Katie Lispet, and Jenny Ziomek. So for me, growing up in an immigrant family, I understand how difficult it can be to learn and understand English. And I've come to realize how powerful visuals can be when it comes to learning a second language. Also, for some context, I'd like to explain a little bit about the demographic of my class. Over half of my students are English language learners, and 14 out of 23 students come from Spanish-speaking families. Next slide, please. When you think about art integration, making art comes to mind. That's what usually pops in, my mind. And I know that the thought of it can be kind of intimidating, especially if you don't have a lot of experience making art or a background in making art, or maybe there's that feeling of not being a good enough artist. So looking at and talking about art is one of the easiest ways to integrate it into the classroom. So to me, it made a lot of sense to incorporate these types of discussions during the designated hour for English language development. Next slide, please. Okay, so for anyone out there that's an LAUSD teacher, you may be familiar with these types of images we'd have to use for constructive conversations. So as you can see on the screen, this is a sample image from the LAUSD Smart Start lessons. Now, while there is a lot to talk about when you see these pictures or visual text, it's usually an image that doesn't seem to connect or resonate with a lot of my students. Okay, next slide, please. So I try to make it a point to showcase artwork and artists that are more reflective of the community they are in, or show them artwork they can connect to culturally. One example is our field trip to LACMA, where we were able to view the Black American portraits and Obama portraits. Prior to going on this field trip, we had constructive conversations around these portraits. We also learned about artists such as Kehinde Wiley, Amy Sherald, and Bisa Butler. It's not pictured here, but the students were especially excited to see the presidential portraits. They know Kehinde Wiley is from Los Angeles and that he was the first Black artist to paint a presidential portrait of the first Black president. So they understood the importance of something like this. They were also able to see the connection that an artist from Los Angeles, a city where they are from, can have such an impact in the art world. Next slide, please. So here is a general structure of what constructive conversations look like in my classroom. The first thing I do is go over conversation norms. Then I show the artwork. Next, using a discussion guide, the students talk with a partner. After that, the students take part in a whole class discussion, which I'd like to call the teddy bear toss, where I use like a little stuffed animal, like a small teddy bear as a talking piece. So whoever is holding the bear gets to be the one to speak. When they're done sharing their ideas, I have a little guest back there. So when they're done sharing their ideas, they call on a classmate, ask them a question, and toss the bear to them so that the student has a turn. Finally, if we are looking at student work, the artist presents their work to the class. Next slide, please. Here are the norms I have my class follow. This is actually from the LAUSD Smart Start lesson plans, and this helps the discussions run smoothly whenever we have constructive conversations. Next slide. To have discussions about art, this is one of the formats I use to help guide my students through the process. And I know Olivia has mentioned this briefly, something she uses with her class too. And so this here are the visual thinking strategies. Some of you may already be familiar with it, but I'll go ahead and review. So the way this works is at first I'll pose the question, what's going on in this picture? Then the students will respond. Next, I'll follow up on the responses by asking, what makes you say that? Then towards the end of the conversation, I'll ask, what else can we find? Next slide. This here is another format I'll use to have constructive conversations, which is what we're going to focus on for today's session. So first I'll ask, what do you see in this artwork? Then what does it make you wonder? And what do you think is going on? Next slide, please. So in a moment, as a whole group, we're going to have a constructive conversation around artwork my students created. So for some context, the students did an art project inspired by the field trip when we viewed the Black American portrait exhibit. After viewing the exhibit, the students had an opportunity to create their own portraits. We used paper, pencil, markers, and oil pastels. Some drew self-portraits, others created portraits of loved ones or people they admire. Next slide. So what you see here is a sample objective I'll use and post for my students. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share it with all of you. Today, we are going to talk about art using See, Wonder, Think by listening to each other, sharing ideas, and taking turns. Next slide. This here is a discussion guide I use for my students. The questions are posed for See, Wonder, Think, and there are sentence starters to use as prompts to help them with their conversations. Next slide. So this is going to be the portrait that we're all going to talk about. So in the next few slides, we're just going to use our thinking time as we view different sections of the artwork, and hopefully this will generate some ideas or questions about the work. Next slide, please. Sorry, I don't know if you could hear my kids back there, but okay. All right, next slide. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now at this time, we're going to start the discussion. You can go ahead and type your responses in the chat, or if you're comfortable, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. So I'll go ahead and pose the first question. What do you think is going on? Well, what do you see in this artwork? Sorry, that's what I meant to say. So what do you see in this artwork? Okay, so I see some responses in the chat. Someone says, I see dinosaurs. One is rainbow striped, one is orange, lots of colors, a dinosaur. I see a hot dog, maybe a volcano, roses. Yeah, these are great responses. A neighborhood, yes. Looks like a home, cats. Okay. Okay. Ooh, lots of responses. Thank you. Someone said they see some killer roses, a rocking dino. That's right. The Mexican flag. Okay. Someone also said, I see a boy in the center with his arms outstretched. Nice. Okay, next question. What does it make you wonder? What questions may you have about this work of art? Okay, Olivia asked, I wonder about the sizes of the objects. Someone asked, what is the striped animal next to the Mexican flag? What was the child thinking? Okay, how are all these objects related? What experience was the student drawing? And I wonder if this is a dream or favorite things. Nice, okay. And then last question. Oh, I like this last response. It makes me think that the piece seems to explore time and identity. Yeah. And actually that's a good lead into the next question, which is, what do you think is going on? Okay, I see someone says, I wonder if I see the word zoo or the number 200. Okay. So what do you think is going on in this picture? It's a party. Yeah, it looks like a party. Or it might be a dream, an adventure. Wow, these are great responses. Thanks. Let's see. The boy is sharing all he loves. This is a daydream and a nightmare. And someone else said, it looks like a fiesta in Mexico. The boy is remembering past experiences. And someone else said, child is thinking about a lot of things, from rainbow dinos to cats. And are these a boy's favorite things? So we'll see. Okay, so I feel like I gotta move on. I know we could probably talk about this for a while. So keep in mind that in the classroom setting, the students would discuss the artwork in pairs, then we'll have a conversation as a whole class. Then at the end of it, the student will present their work and answer any questions others may have. Now, since the student isn't here, I'll give some information about this portrait. So this is a self-portrait. The figure on the bottom represents the artist himself. He is half Mexican and half Guatemalan. You can see that represented by the flags, a sombrero, Guatemalan money, as well as a picture of the town his family is from, which is in the upper right corner. The artist also likes hot dogs, pizza, Minecraft, and dinosaurs. So what you see here is a representation of who he is and what he's all about. All right, next slide. So usually at the end of the constructive conversation and presentation, I'll check in with the students to see how they did with the objective by asking them questions like the ones we see here on the screen. So in closing, my students have been more engaged with constructive conversations using this process. They were also more invested in talking about the artwork of their peers or their own. I noticed that over time, they've grown more comfortable with describing what they see or thinking critically and asking questions. The students would use similar types of dialogue when we're looking at an image for science, social studies, or when I show them an image for a math word problem. So it's really interesting to see how these skills of talking about art carry over into other subject areas. Okay, and that is it for my part. Next slide, please. So if you have any questions or would like to share any ideas with me, feel free to email me. My email info is here. And up next, I'd like to introduce Catherine. She is our third grade teacher. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Cecile. It's always so much fun to hear about my future students. And I will be sharing the work we've been developing in visual arts and math. Next slide, please. I'm working closely with Katie Lipset. Katie Lipset is one of the amazing teacher artists at LACMA. You may have seen her teach during one of LACMA's evenings for educators or on LACMA's YouTube channel. And together we've been creating content centered in patterns, fractions, and symmetry in art and math. I'm going to be sharing how we collaborate to develop lessons, and I'll use examples of my students' work to show our process. Next slide, please. We're specifically working to integrate math concepts from the Common Core State Standards, art from LACMA's collection, the math practices, and we use the National Art Standards. Next slide, please. Third graders learn how to understand fractions and how to discuss geometric shapes and how to persevere in solving problems. They need to use tools such as rulers, and they need to work on precision. Third grade students need to develop an understanding of fractions, beginning with unit fractions, and see how fractions are built out of unit fractions. They use visual fraction models to represent parts of a whole, and they need to understand that the size of a fractional part is relative to the size of the whole. They work on comparing fractions by using visual fraction models. I believe that all of these concepts, which are challenging, are best taught through manipulating materials. Actually cutting an object into parts is more powerful than simply seeing a picture of a shape divided into pieces. Math practices such as making sense of problems and persevering in solving problems are the processes of math thinking or the behaviors of a mathematician, and students need to practice these during all their content areas of math. By integrating these math objectives with LACMA art and art production opportunities, we're building both knowledge and the opportunity for that knowledge to transfer between subjects. Next slide, please. The LACMA art collection supports my instruction in multiple ways. We select pieces of art for use in integrated lessons, and I use those same pieces of art in other parts of my instruction. Giving my students multiple opportunities to discuss art allows them to practice vocabulary and supports the transfer of knowledge. I wanted to point this out as you may find this to be a simple strategy. Using the LACMA art collection. The art is available online in a database, and it's a great place to find inspiration. Next slide, please. Sir Ken Robinson gave the famous TED Talk, "Do Schools Kill Creativity?" He proposed that creativity is as important as literacy, and that further, all children are talented. I truly believe this as well, and I included this particular quote from him because I want my students to take chances and to expect mistakes. Mistakes should be seen as an expected part of the learning process for my students and for me as well, the teacher. Next slide, please. Our cycle of instruction has lessons designed to build vocabulary and concepts in both math and art, and then our integrated lessons bring those concepts together. As I integrate the concepts, I have opportunities for formative assessment, meaning that I use the integrated activity or lesson to make decisions about what my students need. I ask myself, what do I need to develop or extend? Which concepts need to be practiced? And where are my students ready for the next idea? And then I plan lessons, often with Katie, based upon our observations. Next slide, please. Ms. Katie and I began with patterns. Understanding and using patterns is very important in math and as an art element. Ms. Katie had the students look at the bark cloth that you see in the top of the slide. That's a piece of LACMA art. And she discussed the artists, the materials, the various lines that are included as an element of art. Students then practiced creating patterns with various lines. They had an opportunity to create patterns on strips of paper. Next slide, please. And on standard size paper. The long strips of paper encouraged students to repeat shapes. And the artwork you see here was an opportunity to extend those patterns in two directions. Then we took this art into a math discussion where we practiced naming shapes and calling out words or letters to help us find the repetition in the pattern. Next slide, please. We also watched a YouTube video about the bark cloth artists and the process they used, and we looked again more closely at the bark cloth from the LACMA art collection. Students were beginning to be able to identify more patterns and also see the breaks in the patterns that the artists used. Then students created these bark cloth inspired art on paper bags. Next slide, please. Next, Miss Katie and I began to see and really understand the value of creating something during math instruction that I use in math instruction as a manipulative or a device to explain a concept, and then later use those same manipulatives in art instruction. And then once we created art, take the art back for a math discussion. By using the art that the students created as a discussion piece during math instruction, we were providing multiple opportunities for students to discuss concepts and for vocabulary to be reviewed, deepened, and extended. In this slide, you can see the brightly colored pre-cut geometric shapes that we used during math instruction. We folded and cut the circles, squares, and rectangles into fractional pieces. Next slide, please. Ms. Katie led the students in an art lesson using the shapes they created to build symmetrical designs. Students were able to move the collage pieces, those same pieces that they had created in math, to create the symmetrical designs you see. Then I used these collages the next day during math instruction to review vocabulary and to assess the students' understanding of both fractions and symmetry. Next slide, please. We evaluated their artwork and determined that some students needed more opportunities to trace and cut and glue geometric shapes, and that some students were ready for more intricate designs, or maybe a collage project with smaller pieces. Some students were working very precisely, and others were struggling with their collage skills. And the concept of symmetry was just beginning to develop. Next slide, please. In this art lesson, students used pattern pieces to trace and cut squares, rectangles, and circles. The simplified shapes were then assembled into the shape of a lion. They did not design the lion, they followed a pattern, but the tracing and cutting of all the pieces provided them with practice. Each student created 4 lions, choosing their colors for the pattern pieces, and then they decided which lion looked best on which of the 4 background colors. And this artist added details with a pen. Next slide, please. This lesson was an opportunity to practice the collage skills, to build stamina, and to explore color. They used a pattern to trace the shapes, and they looked for repetition. They built stronger tracing, cutting, and gluing skills. This particular artist liked the lions without added details and wanted to create a smaller lion in the bottom rectangle. Next slide, please. Here is an example of sketch notes, an activity where students discussed a piece of LACMA art with their peers and took notes based on the conversation. On the right, we're watching a video about symmetry, and the students took sketch notes while watching the video. These are examples of how I try to provide multiple opportunities to develop vocabulary and concepts. And I do this purposefully to try to support a transfer of knowledge. Next slide, please. Then Ms. Katie moved into radial symmetry using these 2 objects from the LACMA collection. Next slide, please. After discussing radial symmetry, students created these art pieces. Here, students had an opportunity to create their own shapes, sometimes their own collage papers, and then beginning with the geometric shapes of rectangles, squares, and circles, they designed and created their own collage with symmetry. They selected their own colors, created their own shapes, cut those shapes into fractional pieces, and decided how many lines of symmetry they wanted to include in their design. Next slide, please. We then moved on to discussing quilts. In this activity, using only green and blue triangles, students created a quilt block showing symmetry. They were restricted to only these 2 colors, and they had to use 4 green and 4 blue triangles of the same size. The challenge was to be original and show symmetry. This art was helpful in a later math discussion, as students could manipulate the art pieces, turn them, to help discuss symmetry on a horizontal, vertical, or diagonal line. I hung a piece of art on the whiteboard. I hung a piece of yarn on the whiteboard, and students could place their art under the yarn and turn it to try to help them either verify or discuss the lines of symmetry they thought they were seeing. You can see that the student in the lower right-hand corner found a way to kind of break the rules to be original. Next slide, please. Using this piece of LACMA art, the hole in the barn door from the LACMA collection, Ms. Katie challenged the students to see shapes within shapes, to use light and dark colors, and to create one quilt block. We use this art piece in math discussion as we were talking about the definition of a whole, and that a definition of the whole could be easily changeable. For example, if the whole is the smallest square, see just the top two triangles, the whole is divided in half. If the whole is one light pink area, it can be seen as fourths, and so on. Next slide, please. Using the same outline of 32 triangles, we next challenged the students to see a design of their own, to create a design of their own, where half the triangles are light and half are dark, and also they needed to still show symmetry. Evaluating the success of this project allowed for an interesting conversation as students used math terms and art vocabulary to explain designs that were successful in meeting the challenge, while also noticing that some artists didn't strictly follow Ms. Katie's guidelines, but still created an interesting design. Next slide, please. Our next focus area was using and identifying geometric shapes. This piece of art from the LACMA collection allowed students to again practice math vocabulary, now naming shapes and the positions of shapes. While using this art piece, we noticed that students needed more practice in the naming of geometric shapes. Next slide, please. In this lesson, Ms. Katie asked the students to use a ruler and dot paper to create geometric shapes. When we took these art pieces back into our math discussions, students were provided with practice in naming geometric shapes, and they were also using art terms such as overlapping and light and dark colors. Next slide, please. My students and I are finding our math integrated lessons both motivating and inspiring. My students often make positive comments during their math lessons about fractions, such as "I love fractions," and "math is beautiful," and "symmetry is relaxing to look at." Their stamina and their attention span during art production is increasing. Their vocabulary and language skills are greatly improving. Next slide, please. I hope you can see how we're working to be creative teachers, and that you can also see the result of the value we place on developing creativity in our students. If you're a classroom teacher, I encourage you to explore the LACMA art collection and use the art images you find in different areas of your curriculum. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for listening to me discuss my work with my students and with Ms. Katie Lipset. Thank you so much, Katie, for being such a great partner. You're a very important part of the lives of the young artists in 3rd grade. If anyone here would like to discuss our work further, I would love to read an email from you. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to hand it over to Raquela Bases, our 4th grade teacher.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much again for being here. My name is Raquela Bases, and I am the 4th grade teacher at Charles White Visual Arts LACMA Magnet. I am a white Jewish woman with curly dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a black t-shirt and half hoop earrings. And I'm sitting here beside my bookshelf. I will speak a bit about visual arts and social studies integration. LACMA teaching artists Jenny Ziamek, Katie Lipset, and I have developed a series of art and social studies integrated projects to help our students learn and engage meaningfully with social studies content. Today, I will highlight one such project, a 4-page annotated comic book about how the Tongva Native Americans used natural resources in their environment to survive in the time period preceding the Spanish settlement of California. Next slide, please. This project focused on the ways the Gabrieleño Tongva tribe, native to the area in which our school is located, use the resources around them to survive. Each student created their own annotated comic book complete with a cover and 4 pages, each corresponding to a resource category. The categories are plant resources, animal resources, bodies of water, and rocks, shells, and minerals. Next slide, please. We created each of the resource pages in 4 stages, affording students 4 modalities to engage with and process content. We prepared for each page by taking notes, sketching important images, and sketching thumbnails of fully fleshed out scenes to plan our final drafts. Then we drew our illustrations for each comic page on watercolor paper. We added speech bubbles, thought bubbles, and labels to our illustrations. We outlined our drawings with fine black Sharpie and watercolored our images. And finally, after each illustrated page was complete, students wrote a paragraph of informative text to accompany it, explaining how the Tongva used those particular resources to survive. They used information from their notes and from their drawings to write these paragraphs. Next slide, please. Here is an example of some of the notes student took in preparation for the plant resources comic page and text. And here is an example, a photograph of student work of some notes a student took to prepare for the rock, shells, and minerals page. Next slide, please. After taking notes, LACMA teaching artist Jenny Zymek would project isolated images of key elements from the notes for all students to see. She guided students through tracing the images in the air with their fingers or with pencils, and practicing breaking down recognizable objects, like this oak tree, into lines and shapes. Students would complete all practice sketches in their sketchbooks. Here you can see some of the teaching artist examples of an oak tree sketch, an acorn sketch, and a weeping willow sketch, inspired by these 3 photographs. Next slide, please. And here you can see the teaching artist's example of a quiche sketch. A quiche was the Tongva dwelling. You can see that the different parts of the quiche are labeled. Willow branches compose the frame, and reeds and grasses compose the walls. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a student's practice sketches of an oak tree, an acorn, a weeping willow, and a quiche. And you can see that the student labeled those same elements, the same elements of the quiche. Next slide, please. This slide shows the planning phase of a comic page. Students would suggest the placement of the various elements that they had practiced sketching to co-create a thumbnail sketch with the teaching artist. Then students would combine those same elements in their own ways to create unique thumbnail sketches. They would base their final watercolor pages upon their unique thumbnail sketches. Next slide, please. Here is a student's example of a rock, shells, and minerals thumbnail sketch. You can see they included many elements. You can see there's dye for a skirt, soapstone, a spearhead, abalone shells are referenced, and the student laid out all of the elements and planned how their final illustrated comic page would look. Next slide, please. After creating thumbnail versions of comic pages, students would transfer their ideas to final watercolor paper. They would begin by drawing their ideas in pencil. Then they'd outline their pencil drawings with fine point black Sharpie. Finally, they would add color to their work with watercolors. Here you can see 2 comic pages in different stages of development. If you look closely, you will notice speech bubbles and thought bubbles that convey what the student imagined people and also animals in the scenes are saying and thinking. You can also notice a little bit of humor this student employed.
Oh my gosh. Get down.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Yes, I agree. Such attention to detail. Thank you for putting that in the chat. Here is an example of a completed rock, shells, and minerals page. Take a moment to look closely at this image. As we practiced in Cecille Cervancia's presentation, now you have an opportunity to share with us what you notice. What do you notice when you look at this image? You can write your answers in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and share out loud if you're comfortable. Thank you. Labels, greenery. Thank you. The use of watercolors. Thank you. Some negotiating. Thank you for sharing. Action, dialogue, wonderful. A quiche, big sky and a river, barter system. Great, excellent. Greenery. Thank you so much. Excellent, thank you for your contributions. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a completed bodies of water page. Take a moment to look closely at this image. If you'll notice, this aerial view includes a depiction of the Pacific Ocean and the Los Angeles River, the primary saltwater and freshwater bodies of water the Tongva use to meet their needs. What else do you notice? So again, feel free to place your ideas in the chat or unmute and share out loud if you're comfortable. Thank you. Different colors to represent the ocean versus the river for fresh and salt water. Thank you. Looks like a map, perspective, bird's eye view, aerial perspective, rapids. Thank you. Animals and plant life. Yes, you can see that students repeated elements that they had practiced drawing for other comic pages throughout their books, throughout all 4 pages of their books. A whale, whale in the ocean. Wonderful. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you. Next slide, please. After the comic pages were drawn, labeled, and colored, students wrote paragraphs of informative text to accompany them. Each student ended this project with 4 paragraphs of informative text, 1 for each resource category. They would draw upon information from their notes, practice sketches, and final illustrations to write these paragraphs. Here is a sample of student writing on how the Tongva used rocks, shells, and minerals in their daily lives. So in the interest of time, you can just take a quick look at this paragraph. Thank you. Next slide, please. After completing all 4 comic pages and informative text paragraphs, students would create covers for their comic books. They would begin by sketching thumbnails for their covers just like they did of each resource page. And the thumbnails needed to include an element or multiple elements from each of the 4 resource pages. So you can see if you look closely here, this student has the bodies of water, or at least the river, plants, animals, and a little pile of soapstone, what looks to be soapstone, next to the quiche. The students would also brainstorm titles. And as you can see, the students settled on Tale of the Tongva. Next slide, please. Finally, students would publish their comic books. Students organized their pages and glued the corresponding paragraphs of informative text to the blank side of the pages that would be opposite their illustrations when the books were laid open. Students bound their comics by punching holes along one edge and fastening them with string that resembles dried reeds like those the Tongva used to weave baskets and sandals. Next slide, please. Here's an expanded view of a student's completed comic book. You can see the cover, bodies of water page, then the plant resources page, then the animal resources page, and finally the rock shells and minerals page. Next slide, please. This project took approximately 5 weeks to complete. 1 week to plan and illustrate each page and to write the corresponding paragraphs of text, and an additional week to create covers, finish outstanding work, and publish the comics. It is possible to execute this concept across various content areas and over shorter lengths of time. In our class, we also created a single-page, 3-panel historical fiction comic about seeking success in the California gold rush. Next slide, please. This slide shows the guidelines for each panel of this social studies comic. After learning about the gold rush, people's motivations to come to Northern California, and vocations once they arrived, students created historical fiction comics in which they imagined themselves to be characters who had come from near or far to try their luck in 1849. In the first panel, students had to draw and write to show us who they were, where they were coming from, and how they had heard about the gold rush. In the second panel, students had to write what they were doing in Northern California to make money. Were they mining for gold, or were they a merchant selling goods to miners? Or perhaps selling a service, like washing laundry or mending clothes. And in the third panel, students would have to illustrate and write if they were successful. Did they strike it rich, or did they fall upon bad luck? Thank you. Next slide, please. Here is a student sample of a finished gold rush historical fiction comic. So you can see this student traveled, or this character that the student created, traveled from China by ship and found a house and found some gold that's in the thought bubble and struck it rich. And evidence of striking it rich is the student wrote, "I have a house and a job." Next slide, please. I will leave you with 2 questions to ponder. First, how might you use comics to engage students with your classroom content? And second, how else might you integrate art, social studies, and writing in your own classrooms or settings? Next slide, please. Thank you again for attending our presentation. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, comments, or ideas. And on behalf of all 4 of us LACMA Magnet teachers, we would like to thank all the LACMA teachers: Erin, Holly, Jenny, Katie L, Katie U, Maria, and of course, Lara, for inviting us. Thank you. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. At this point in the evening, you will be divided into breakout rooms, in which you will have 10 minutes to discuss these 2 questions. Do you remember a time in your childhood when visual arts supported your learning? And what are your biggest takeaways from the teachers' presentations? Thank you so much.
I see people are starting to filter back from the breakout rooms. I'll wait a couple more seconds before we move on to the next part of the program. Okay, I think just about everybody is back now. Thank you all so much. I also want to say a really big thank you to our presenters, Olivia, Cecile, Catherine, and Raquela, for dedicating extra time and energy to making your work and your process available to other teachers. You have no idea how invaluable that is. So on behalf of everyone at LACMA, thank you so much. As you can see in the chat, everybody really loved it. So now is an opportunity for folks to share maybe what they talked about in the breakout rooms, if there were any really important takeaways, and also to ask our presenters some follow-up questions. So I'm going to open up the floor to all of you in the audience. You can use the raise hand function to let us know that you'd like to speak, or you can put your questions and comments in the chat.
Okay, well, I thought they were amazing. I thought each presentation was great. I got a little bit out of everything. The young lady I was in the breakout room with, I liked her experience that she shared, and it was about a time when I believe she said she was in 4th grade, and her and I believe it was a neighbor child, I'm not sure, but they created a book together. So they kind of wrote about a story, and the story was about a child that was adopted. And it was a racial story because the child was African American and the parents were white. And so it was, I guess, about the struggles of the child. And I thought that that was really interesting. One, for that that grade level to pay attention to something like that. And it was something that she said that she put in the back of her mind, or she never really kind of thought about it until she looked at the picture of the young man where we did the first we wondering what was in the picture, why, what it was, what it was about, and then to have this child show with a split screen 2 different lives that he's already lived. And he's only like, what, maybe 7 or 8 years old, and he's able to illustrate and articulate those things that were important to him. So I thought that was kind of cool. My memory that I shared was my mom went back to school when I was about 10 to get her degree, and it was in the medical field. So she had to do illustrations for her homework sometimes, and I was the one that drew the illustrations. So that was kind of cool, you know, as a child to do something like that. And yeah, I'll stop talking now.
Well, that was great. Thanks for sharing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have questions from anybody else in the audience? Don't be shy.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please. Hi, Gustavo.
Hey, hello, everybody. Great presentation. I enjoyed everything that was shared today. I'm a LACMA teaching artist, but not at Charles White. So it's great to see what's been going on. And I was curious, are there plans to link Charles White to like a local middle school or high school in terms of continuing like a ladder of arts programming through, you know, arts integration programming throughout?
Are you volunteering to do that? Because we would love that.
I guess I
you.
am.
Thank you,
I just think
Gustavo.
I think it's amazing. But you know, this partnership, of course, been for many years with LACMA and Charles White. It's exciting to see it growing in these new ways. But yeah, I'm just curious. Have you thought of it? Have you pursued it in any way?
We've definitely talked about it, and it's definitely been on our mind. You know, there's been a couple things, maybe the second year, oh no, the first year that we had a teacher's strike, and the second year we had pandemic, and then last year's online. So it has definitely been pushed to the side a little bit, and we're just trying to, you know, do the best we can. But we would love for our students to go somewhere after they culminate from Charles White to continue this kind of learning. We have talked a little bit about where that could possibly be, because most of our students are local community students, you know, they live in our community. And so we have thought about where that could possibly be. We actually also have our new magnet coordinator here with us, Miss Coronado. Hi. So she's new with us, so maybe she's listening too. So we got all these volunteers to help us, and hopefully we could get that going.
Thank you.
I practice trying to be comfortable with silences. So I'm doing that right now and try not to be impatient. But I really would love to invite anybody else who has questions for our amazing Charles White teachers to come on the mic or write in the chat before we end for the evening.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for your talks. There were two things that jumped out at me that I thought were amazing. One was when you were talking about inviting students to draw with other than the pencil, you know, because the drawing can be intimidating, to draw with their words, to draw with their hands, and also the affirmations that you were asking the students to do. Because the way that I read that was that you were talking about your goals and then restating your goals via an affirmation, which I thought was incredible. So I guess if I have a question would be, is there any other kind of cool way that you have of kind of translating what you're doing, the course curriculum, or the technical aspects of what you're doing into either an affirmation or via any other kind of approachable way? Any other cool things that you use in your teaching on a regular basis that seems to jump out at you like these two did to me?
Yeah, with the affirmations, it's kind of an interesting way that it came about. I usually use them as a social emotional tool for students. We have one in general for the class for the week. So this week's they came up with blank will focus and pay attention. They came up with that one. And sometimes it's, and I taught them that I learned this somewhere, that when you say your own name in an affirmation, it's more powerful for some reason. So they say, we all whisper it to ourselves or say it in our heads. But I find that affirmations, it helps. It's a great strategy for them in different content areas as well. And that especially with the pandemic and just the social emotional needs of our students and ourselves right now, it probably started because I needed affirmations. Like Miss Martinez is patient and loving. Miss Martinez is patient and loving. I probably was saying it to myself, but that kind of came to me in that way, that the objectives, I've been teaching for a while, and we used to have to write the standards on the board, and that just seemed kind of weird. Like students wouldn't really take ownership of it. And then even writing the objective in a kid-friendly way didn't quite seem to work. So the affirmations were a way of them kind of internalizing what we were going to do and their goals. But I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. Maybe somebody else in the group can.
This is kind of a loose connection to what you're talking about, but sort of like a surprise sort of for me, I guess, is the power of comic books. Without much guided instruction, just having a library of comic books and then space and time to write a comic book has encouraged hesitant writers in my classroom to combine pictures and words in a way that I hadn't explored before in my career. So that would just, it's kind of a loose connection, but it would be something where you're sort of surprised that how simple it can be and yet how powerful it can be. I guess the comic book strategy would be that for me.
And I see we have one question in the chat. How long has the Charles White LACMA partnership been in place? And do we partner with other schools? I'll respond to that one in the chat, but the question about the LACMA Charles White partnership, I'll turn over to you all.
So I know the Magnet Center has been around since 2018, right? But prior to that, I think there was, there was a partnership with the homeschool and LACMA. And I think, I forgot what the program was called, but I think that was going on for a while. I'm not sure how many years because that was before I came to the school. So I don't know if anyone here could answer how long the, I don't know if it was like the residence program or something. I forgot the exact name.
I also unfortunately do not know. It's before my time at LACMA as well. There might be somebody on staff here who could answer that question. Well, that just about brings us to 6:30. So I want to thank you all again for being here with us this evening. I see some nice comments coming into the chat again. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your enthusiasm, and extra special thanks to the Charles White teachers who are here with us this evening. We appreciate you. Good night, everybody.